Have you ever felt as if life were an endless cycle? As if no matter how hard you tried, you were always pushing the same stone, climbing the same mountain, carrying the same weight on your shoulders? This is the silent burden of many of us, the invisible weight of existence. We call it anxiety, fatigue, routine. But perhaps its true name is Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was a cunning king, as intelligent as he was proud. He defied the gods, deceived death, and believed he could control fate. But like all who try to escape the inevitable, he was condemned not by the god's power, but by the soul's own stubbornness. His punishment was simple and perfect: to push eternally a stone up the slope of a mountain, only to watch it roll back down just before reaching the summit, and so again and again. Sisyphus awakens to the same effort, the same weight, the same ending. There is no truce, no progress, no conclusion, only return. How many times have you woken up like this, pushing commitments, worries, expectations? How many times have you felt that nothing changes, even when you do everything right? The same effort, the same exhaustion, and the same feeling that the stone always falls. The myth of Sisyphus is a cruel and true metaphor for the human condition. It speaks of the absurdity of repetition, the erosion of time, the anguish of knowing that life moves, yet always circles back. And deep down, that is the essence of modern anxiety, a mind that never rests, replaying the same thought, the same fear, the same doubt, as if every morning we awoke to push again the weight of existence. Sisyphus tries to deceive death, and it is precisely for that reason he is condemned to an infinite cycle. In the psychology of the shadow, we would say he tries to deny the inevitable. Finitude, limitation, the end, and the more we deny death, the more it haunts us in small doses, in the fear of failure, the fear of loss, the fear of not being enough. Anxiety is born from this same impulse, the desperate attempt to control what cannot be controlled. We want to predict the future, avoid pain, ensure safety, but life, like Sisyphus' gods, always finds a way to remind us that we are not eternal. In the myth, the mountain is time, the stone is the mind and the punishment. His consciousness: the more we think, the heavier the thought becomes. The more we seek meaning, the further it seems. But there is a turning point. Sisyphus is not only a victim. There are moments when, as he descends the mountain once again, he smiles. Albert Camus, reinterpreting the myth, wrote, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy not because he triumphed, but because he understood, because he found meaning in the act itself, not in the result, but in presence." And perhaps this is where the myth becomes a mirror. The peace we seek is not at the top, nor at the end of the task, but in the moment we accept the cycle and choose to continue. Lucidly, Sisyphus does not defeat the stone, he defeats despair, and that may be the greatest victory a human being can achieve. In the language of psychology, this lesson returns with another name: active acceptance. It's when we stop fighting the inevitable and begin to participate in it. Anxiety eases when we stop trying to control it. Suffering transforms when we observe it instead of resisting. Yet the mountain remains. The weight remains, but something within shifts. Consciousness matures, and the same gesture, once punishment, becomes ritual. Perhaps that is what Sisyphus discovers in the silence of the underworld. That punishment, when understood, becomes a path, and that time, when accepted, ceases to be an enemy. Because to live is this: to repeat the effort, lose your breath, look upward, and still push, not for the hope of glory, but for love of the very act of existing. Have you ever noticed how time seems to move differently when we're anxious? The minutes drag, the days blur, the weeks repeat. It's as if we're trapped in an invisible loop, a circle where nothing truly changes, even though everything keeps turning. That is Sisyphus's prison. There are no bars, no chains, there's only time, and the awareness of being inside it. Sisyphus's punishment is not merely to push the stone, it is to know that it will always fall. It is the curse of one who understands time too deeply, who perceives eternity and yet can never escape it. Sisyphus lives in the moment, where again becomes a sentence, and perhaps that is the essence of anxiety. The mind that cannot bear return, the body that feels the weight of tomorrow before it even arrives, the heart that tries to control what is already happening. In mythology, the time of the underworld does not flow like the time of the living. Down there, the clock doesn't move, or if it breathes, it is circular time, returning time, repeating time. And this is Sisyphus's hell, the eternal now. Neither past nor future, only the present, multiplied infinitely. In the modern world, we call this chronic anxiety, when the mind can't stop revisiting what went wrong or anticipating what hasn't yet happened. We live, like Sisyphus, pushing thoughts uphill, believing that if we think enough, we'll find control. But the thought falls, and the cycle begins again. Sisyphus's rock is made of what-ifs. What if I fail? What if I lose? What if there isn't enough time? Time becomes the enemy, remember, not because of the minutes themselves, but because of the fear they carry. Kronos, the god of time, devoured his own children because he feared being overthrown by them. And like Kronos, anxiety makes us devour the present, afraid of what the future might do to us. The result is always the same. Time consumes us, and we feed it with every worry, every urgency, every race to nowhere. Modern psychology translates this myth into another language. It calls it hypervigilance, the state in which the body lives in constant alert, as if something terrible were about to happen. Even in silence, it's the body saying, "Be ready," and the mind replying, "For what?" That is the mountain of the anxious, an endless climb without pause, without reward. But the myth of Sisyphus hides a key. In the moment he walks back down the mountain to retrieve the stone, there is a breath, what Camus called tragic. Lucidity, it's the instant when Sisyphus knows and still chooses to continue, because even punishment can become consciousness, and even repetition can contain wisdom. In shadow psychology, Jung describes this moment as the encounter with the unconscious, when we look within and finally see what we've been avoiding: anxiety, fear, despair, all our ghosts reflected in the stone we push. And then we realize the punishment is not pushing the rock, but pretending it isn't ours. The rock is made of everything we deny, the postponed decisions, the words unspoken, the unresolved pain. Each return to the mountain is the soul's attempt to process what the ego still cannot bear. That's why the cycle continues. That's why time doesn't move. Sisyphus is not just a myth. He is the portrait of the psyche. When time becomes a prison, when the past weighs heavy, and the future threatens, when the mind grows tired of thinking and the body grows tired of existing. But there is a way out, not an escape, but a conscious surrender. Liberation begins when we stop fighting time and start listening to it, because time is not the enemy, it is the teacher, and the stone that crushes us today may become the altar where we learn to rest tomorrow. Sisyphus slowly discovers that eternity is not outside, it is within. Time is not the god's punishment, but the mirror of the human. And true hell was never repetition. It was our inability to find meaning within it. When he understands this, something shifts. The stone keeps rolling, but his gaze rolls with it, and between the pushing and the falling, Sisyphus begins to see the invisible, the poetry of effort, the value of awareness, the beauty of the moment. Time, after all, is the substance from which the soul is made, and eternity is not found at the top of the climb, but in the simple act of continuing with presence, with surrender, with lucidity. Have you ever noticed how the ego is a patient sculptor? It shapes your rock every day with every expectation, every comparison, every fear of not being enough. And without realizing it, you become Sisyphus himself, pushing the weight of the image you've built of yourself, fighting against a reflection you no longer recognize. Sisyphus believed he could deceive the gods, conquer death, and defy fate. But the punishment he received did not come from above. It came from within. For those who try to be greater than human limits end up crushed by the very size they invent. The ego, when it grows too large, becomes the stone that drags us up the mountain, a burden made of control and vanity. Sisyphus's rock is not just an object, it's a symbol. It represents everything humans try to carry alone: the need to be admired, the pursuit of perfection, the fear of failure. Each layer of this stone is a story we tell ourselves. I need to prove my worth. I can't disappoint anyone. I can't stop now. And so, the weight grows not because of the gods, but because of the accumulation of our own demands. In shadow psychology, Jung reminds us that what we do not accept within ourselves returns in disguise. What we deny controls us. What we repress governs us. Sisyphus refuses his mortality and is therefore condemned to eternity. We who refuse our fragility are condemned to exhaustion. We live trapped in the cycle of pushing the ego stone every day, the stone of performance, comparison, and the constant need to prove we are someone. The ego is a master at convincing us that if we just reach the summit, everything will make sense. But the truth is different. The summit never arrives, and when it finally seems close, the stone slips away, rolling back to the beginning as if the universe itself whispered, "It isn't the peak you're missing, it's the silence within." Sisyphus is not punished for his mistake, but for his refusal to listen. He is the symbol of a consciousness that insists on controlling the uncontrollable, that tries to hold still what was meant to change, and that is exactly what anxiety does. It turns the natural movement of life into a battlefield. We want everything to stay in place, to never disappoint anyone, to keep time from taking what we love. And in our effort to hold the world still, we end up crushed by it. In shadow psychology, the ego is the mask we wear to survive, necessary, yet dangerous. Without it, we are vulnerable. With it, we are prisoners. It's the ego that whispers, "Keep pushing, keep controlling," but it's the soul that, exhausted, replies, "Until when?" Anxiety is born exactly in that space, between what the ego demands and what the soul can endure. On the outside, it looks like strength. On the inside, it's fear disguised as control. And the cruelest part is that the ego feeds on the very struggle it creates. It needs effort to exist. It needs the mountain, the repetition, the resistance. Because without conflict, it disappears. And for the ego, that is the same as death. That's why Sisyphus never lets the stone fall completely. He chases it. He loves it. He needs it, just as we do. When we can't let go of the inner battles that have already lost their meaning, we keep pushing. Even knowing the top brings no peace, we keep fighting. When what we truly need is to release. But there is a moment when the myth becomes a mirror of healing. As Sisyphus descends the mountain, there is a pause, and in that pause, something happens. He is no longer the man who climbs. The descent is the moment when the ego dissolves and the human returns. Without glory, without mask, without illusion, only body, time and weight, nothing more. Psychology calls this integration. It's when we stop fighting our shadows and begin to listen to them. When we stop pushing the rock of perfection and start recognizing the value of the unfinished. The ego seeks control, but the soul seeks meaning. And only when we understand this difference do we find the path to peace. Sisyphus's punishment is the same as ours, to carry the weight of what we should have already forgiven. But forgiveness is not forgetting. It is liberation. It's not dropping the stone. It's changing the way we see it. The rock remains. The effort remains, but when the burden becomes the teacher, suffering turns into wisdom. Sisyphus is not merely condemned. He is being shaped. Each ascent is a lesson in humility. Each fall a lesson in limits. Each repetition an invitation to lucidity. In mythology, the gods punish him for his arrogance, but perhaps in the silence of the underworld they are teaching him. The stone is his mirror, the mountain his consciousness and time. The therapist forcing him to look within. While pushing his rock, Sisyphus discovers something we too have forgotten, that true hell is not in repetition. It is in meaninglessness, and true paradise begins when, even without the promise of victory, we keep walking, conscious, whole, knowing that the weight we carry may also be the very thing that awakens us. Have you noticed that the greatest changes don't happen on the climb, but on the descent? It's not when we're conquering, it's when we're falling. It's there, between exhaustion and surrender, that the spirit begins to see. Sisyphus, weary from pushing his stone, descends the mountain once more. With each step, he feels the weight of defeat, the echo of repetition, the loneliness of one who already knows the end of the story. But in that silent descent, something begins to change. The punishment remains, but awareness awakens. For the first time, Sisyphus looks at the stone without anger. He observes its imperfections, its cracks, and understands the rock is him. The stone carries his choices, his lies, his attempts to escape death. And as he walks downward, the king who defied the gods meets at the bottom of the abyss, the reflection of the human who forgot what it means to be mortal. The myth shows us what psychology calls the moment of shadow integration, when the unconscious finally reveals itself, when we stop running and start looking at what's been chasing us. Sisyphus begins to realize that suffering is not the opposite of wisdom, it's the path to it. Pain, when crossed with lucidity, ceases to be punishment and becomes a rite of passage. That is why the descent is sacred. Because within it, there is no illusion of control. On the way up, we still believe we can win. On the way down, all that remains is acceptance, and that acceptance is the beginning of freedom. How many times in life do we try to escape pain, only to end up back at the same point? How many times do we mistake failure for the end, when it was only an invitation to descend deeper into ourselves? Anxiety, guilt, fear, they all lead us to the same inner landscape, the underworld of the psyche, where the soul, tired of resisting, begins to listen. Carl Jung once said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's exactly what Sisyphus does. He doesn't flee from the dark. He descends willingly, even knowing what he'll find there. And in the silence of the abyss, he discovers that the mountain he climbs is the same one that lives inside him. To descend is to accept the human condition, to recognize that life is imperfect, that time is cyclical, that suffering is part of the process, not a flaw in the system. On the climb, we search for control. On the descent, we find meaning. The pain that once crushed him now becomes his teacher. Sisyphus begins to understand that his punishment wasn't meant to destroy him, but to refine him. Each fall teaches humility. Each restart reveals strength. Each repetition builds presence. Modern psychology calls this conscious resilience, the ability to transform the impact of pain into understanding. But ancient wisdom knew this long. Ego in the Orphic mysteries, the soul that descended into Hades, didn't go there to die, but to remember who it was before it was born. And that's what Sisyphus does. He remembers. He remembers limitation, time, silence, mortality. He remembers what the ego had forgotten. There is a strange beauty in the image of Sisyphus descending the mountain, his body tired, his feet wounded, his gaze empty, but within him, a faint thread of serenity begins to glow. He knows he will climb again, but for the first time, that no longer frightens him. The awareness of eternal return becomes acceptance, and where there once was despair, a spark of wisdom is born. Anxiety dissolves when we understand that there is no end to reach, only movement. The weight of life doesn't disappear. It changes form, and in accepting it, Sisyphus discovers what the Stoics already knew. Freedom is not found in escaping pain, but in becoming greater than it. On the descent, he no longer seeks meaning at the summit. Meaning now lives in the step itself, in the repeated gesture, in the conscious breath. Sisyphus is no longer the man who tries to defy the gods. He is the man who learns to walk among them. And when we descend our own mountains, when we accept the fall, the grief, the silence, we, too, touch that same wisdom. For pain is the initiation of the soul, and what we call failure may simply be the way destiny found it to teach us to see with new eyes, though. Conscious descent is the moment when hell becomes a sanctuary and there, where everything seems lost. The human meets the divine once again, not in the glory of victory, but in the humility of continuing. Have you ever imagined smiling in the face of your own condemnation? Not a cynical smile, nor a desperate one, but the kind that is born from lucidity, from the calm understanding of one who sees everything clearly and still chooses to continue. This is the smile of Sisyphus, the most silent and most powerful gesture in all of Greek mythology. After countless ascents and descents, after understanding weight, time, and ego, Sisyphus finally learns the secret the gods hid from mankind. Freedom is not found in defeating fate, it is found in embracing it. Camus, centuries later, would call this the metaphysical revolt, the moment when a person, confronted with the absurdity of life, decides to continue, not out of hope, but out of awareness. Sisyphus, the eternally condemned, becomes the symbol of the awakened mind, the being who recognizes the futility of the struggle and, precisely because of that, finds meaning in every movement. There is something deeply human in this image because all of us push invisible stones, jobs that never end, expectations that never fulfill, dreams that always seem one step away, and amidst it all, we long for an ending, a pause, a moment of relief. But perhaps freedom lies in realizing that the meaning of life is not found at the summit, but in being present as we climb. Sisyphus discovers that he does not need to defeat time. He can walk beside it. The stone is no longer an enemy, it is a companion. Each return to the mountain is a new moment of consciousness, a new opportunity to observe the weight and transform it into learning. In shadow psychology, this is the stage of full integration, the point at which the individual, after facing his own pain, no longer tries to eliminate it. He includes it. Sisyphus realizes that the death he feared so deeply already lives within him, in each cycle, in every return, and that this daily death, far from being a tragedy, is what makes him free. Life, after all, is made of small deaths, the childhood that dies so the adult can be born, the love that ends, the time that passes, the old versions of ourselves that fade with every sunrise. By accepting his rock, Sisyphus accepts these deaths too. He sees that the end is not a mistake. It is the natural rhythm of existence, and that to flee from death is the same as fleeing from life itself. It is at this point that the smile appears, not as surrender, but as illumination. The smile of Sisyphus is the victory of consciousness over despair. He no longer waits for relief, he becomes the relief. While the gods expected to see him broken, they found him serene, and that is the greatest. Challenge humanity can offer the divine tranquility before destiny. Modern psychology calls this radical acceptance, the ability to be at peace even when nothing changes, to recognize that suffering exists, but it doesn't have to define us. Sisyphus understands that suffering is not in the stone, but in resisting the act of pushing it. When the act becomes a choice, the burden becomes a path, and in that instant, the underworld ceases to be hell. Hades becomes a temple, the mountain an altar, and punishment a ritual of self-knowledge. Sisyphus no longer seeks redemption, for he has realized that redemption is the very act of existing with awareness. His smile is the same one that appears in those who have faced deep pain and suddenly understand, nothing changed, but I did. The world remains the same, the stone still rolls, time still repeats, but something new has emerged, consciousness. And it is that consciousness that makes him invincible. In mythology, Sisyphus was punished for defying the gods. In psychology, he is remembered as the man who learned to defy his own ego. And in life, he represents all of us, those who, between falls and new beginnings, learn to transform pain into wisdom and absurdity into presence. The smile of Sisyphus is the opposite of denial. It is absolute acceptance, the courage to look at chaos and say, yes, it is so, and still to keep climbing, because to live is not to flee from suffering, it is to give it meaning. Many seek a purpose as if it were a fixed point, a destination to reach. But purpose is not the summit, it is the movement itself. The rock is not the obstacle, it is the exercise. And each conscious gesture, each breath in the face of the impossible is a small victory against despair. Death, then, loses its dominion. For one who has learned to smile before pain no longer fears the end. He understands it as part of the cycle, as the night that prepares the dawn. And in that moment, Sisyphus, the eternal condemned, becomes a symbol of freedom. There is no greater victory than finding peace amid repetition. There is no truer enlightenment than accepting the absurd and loving life anyway. And so, in the silence of the underworld, Sisyphus climbs once more, the stone in his hands, time in his body, and a smile on his face. Have you ever felt like you're pushing the world every day? You wake up early, rush, produce, promise you'll rest, but never do. You meet deadlines, chase recognition, try to keep everything balanced, and still, the summit feels far away. It's the same movement as Sisyphus, disguised by modern routine. The rock has a new name now: adulthood, responsibility, performance. And the underworld is no longer a punishment from the gods. It's everyday life, this labyrinth of repetitions where humans try, day after day, to prove they are winning against time. But time, as always, watches in silence. It doesn't hurry, doesn't sympathize, doesn't justify itself. It simply passes, and within that passing, Sisyphus, and we with him, learns the hardest truth of all. Life is made of efforts without guarantees. Sisyphus is not merely a figure from mythology. He is the portrait of the modern human being. The exhausted worker, the anxious student, the artist who doubts his own talent, the woman trying to be everything at once, the person who demands perfection without mercy. Each one in their own way pushes their stone up the mountain. There is something tragic in this, but also something magnificent. Because to push is to resist. To push is to exist. Each attempt, each restart, is a silent cry against the void, a gesture that says, even without promises, I continue. In psychology, this movement is called vital force, the energy that makes us rise even when nothing makes sense. It's the impulse to live, even in the face of the absurd. And this is what makes Sisyphus, paradoxically, a symbol of hope. Not the naive hope of one who believes in miracles, but the lucid hope of one who understands life's weight and still honors it through effort. The stone he carries is the reflection of human consciousness. Heavy, yes, but full of purpose. It teaches us that the value of existence does not lie in the result, but in presence. Sisyphus doesn't push to win. He pushes because he knows that if he stops, he dies. And that is the mystery of the soul. The same burden that exhausts us is also what keeps us alive. Camus said, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, but perhaps happy isn't the right word. We should imagine him whole, awake, reconciled, present, because once he understands that the mountain is eternal, he stops waiting for the end, and then what once was punishment becomes meditation. In mythology, the underworld is the place of naked truth, where all masks fall and only the essential remains. There, Sisyphus finds the wisdom the living world forgot, that suffering is inevitable, but despair is a choice, that death is certain, but how we live until it comes is a decision. And that meaning is not given. It is built stone by stone, gesture by gesture. Shadow psychology would say that Sisyphus has integrated his unconscious. He no longer fights against destiny because he has learned to walk with it. His mountain is not an obstacle. It's a metaphor for the soul itself. And every ascent is a silent conversation with the divine within him. Perhaps that is what the myth was teaching us all along. That life is made of repetition, yes, but every repetition can be different if we are conscious. That effort never ends. But the way we experience it can change everything, and that in the end, it is not the stone that weighs us down. It is forgetting why we push it. Sisyphus climbs once more, his body weary, his face lit by the fire of his own spirit. The rock touches his calloused hands and, for a moment, feels light, not because it has become smaller, but because he has stopped resisting. And we, watching from the heights of time, can learn from him to accept the burden and, within it, find meaning, to see routine as ritual, effort as meditation, and wait as a call to consciousness. Because to live is this, a continuous act of pushing and learning, falling and beginning again. There is no final victory, no definitive summit. There is only the present moment, that interval between the push and the breath where eternity hides. And when we understand this, the stone ceases to be a punishment and becomes the symbol of life itself. And life, which once felt too heavy, reveals itself, brief, fragile, yet infinitely meaningful. Here the myth of Sisyphus ends, but the journey continues, because as long as there is consciousness, as long as there is a human willing to climb, the world will keep turning, not because it must, but because we choose to continue. And in that silent gesture, in the simple act of going on, the absurd transforms into eternity. Here we end another crossing. Remember, memento mori. We are all travelers through the shadows, and each conscious step is a flame that illuminates eternity.